Good morning. Welcome to a new episode of First Chapter Fridays. My name is Megan and I'm here at the Cazenovia Public Library. Today I'm going to read the first chapter and the prologue of Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This book is recommended for ages 16 and up, mostly because of the trigger warnings, which involve slavery. There's mentions of rape, forced pregnancy, war violence, etc. So this one is recommended for a slightly older age range than the books that I've previously shared. Let's get started. On the second Sabbath of 12th moon in the city of Weep, a girl fell from the sky. Her skin was blue, her blood was red. She broke over an iron gate, crimping it on impact, and there she hung, impossibly arched, graceful as a temple dancer swooning on a lover's arm. One slick finial anchored her in place. Its point, protruding from her sternum, glittered like a brooch. She fluttered briefly as her ghost shook loose, and torched ginger buds rained out of her long hair. Later, they would say these had been hummingbird hearts and not blossoms at all. They would say she hadn't shed blood but wept it, that she was lewd, tonguing her teeth at them upside down and dying, that she vomited a serpent that turned to smoke when it hit the ground. They would say a flock of moths came, frantic, and tried to lift her away. That was true. Only that. They hadn't a prayer, though. The moths were no bigger than the startled mouths of children, and even dozens together could only pluck at the strands of her darkening hair until their wings sagged, sodden with her blood. They were pearled away with the blossoms as a grit-choked gust came blasting down the street. The earth heaved underfoot. The sky spun on its axis. A queer brilliance lanced through the billowing smoke, and the people of Weep had to squint against it. Blowing grit and hot light and the stink of saltpeter. There had been an explosion. They might have died, all and easily, but only this girl had, shaken from some pocket of the sky. Her feet were bare. Her mouth stained damson. Her pockets were all full of plums. She was young and lovely and surprised and dead. She was also blue. Blue as opals, pale blue. Blue as cornflowers or dragonfly wings or a spring, not summer, sky. Someone screamed. The scream drew others. The others screamed too, not because a girl was dead, but because the girl was blue. And this meant something in the city of Weep. Even after the sky stopped reeling and the earth settled, and the last fumes sputtered from the blast site and dispersed, the screams went on, feeding themselves from voice to voice, a virus of the air. The blue girl's ghost gathered itself and perched, bereft, upon the spear-point tip of the projecting finial, just an inch above her own still chest. Gasping in shock, she tilted back her invisible head and gazed mournfully up. The screams went on, and across the city, atop a monolithic wedge of seamless, mirror-smooth metal, a statue stirred, as though awakened by the tumult, and slowly lifted its great horned head. Chapter 1. Names may be lost or forgotten. No one knew that better than Laszlo Strange. He'd had another name first, but it had died like a song with no one left to sing it. Maybe it had been an old family name, burnished by generations of use. Maybe it had been given to him by someone who loved him. He liked to think so, but he had no idea. All he had were Laszlo and Strange. Strange because that was the surname given to all foundlings in the kingdom of Zosma, and Laszlo after a monk's tongueless uncle. He had it cut out on a prison galley, Brother Argos told him when he was old enough to understand. He was an eerie, silent man, and you were an eerie, silent babe. So it came to me, Laszlo. I had to name so many babies that year I went with whatever popped into my head. He added as an afterthought, didn't think you'd live anyway. That was the year Zosma sank to its knees and bled great gouts of men into a war about nothing. The war, of course, did not content itself with soldiers. Fields were burned, villages pillaged. Bands of displaced peasants roamed the raised countryside, fighting the crows for gleanings. So many died that the tumbrils used to cart thieves to the gallows were repurposed to carry orphans to the monasteries and convents. They arrived like shipments of lambs. To hear the monks tell it, and with no more knowledge of their provenance than lambs either. Some were old enough to know their names at least, but Laszlo was just a baby, and an ill one no less. "Gray as rain you were," Brother Argos said. "Thought sure you'd die, but you ate and you slept, and your color came normal in time. Never cried, never once, and that was unnatural, but we liked you for it fine. None of us became monks to be nursemaids." To which the child Laszlo replied with fire in his soul, "And none of us became children to be orphans." But an orphan he was, and strange, and though he was prone to fantasy, he never had any delusions about that. Even as a little boy, he understood that there would be no revelations. No one was coming for him, and he would never know his own true name, which is perhaps why the mystery of Weep captured him so completely. There were two mysteries, actually, one old, one new. The old one opened his mind, but it was the new one that climbed its side, turned several circles, and settled in with a grunt like a satisfied dragon in a cozy new lair. And there it would remain, the mystery in his mind, exhaling enigma for years to come. It had to do with a name, and the discovery that, in addition to being lost or forgotten, they could also be stolen. He was 5 years old when it happened, a charity boy at Zemonin Abbey, and he snuck away to the old orchard that was the haunt of nightwings and lacewings to play by himself. It was early winter. The trees were black and bare. His feet breached a crust of frost with every step, and the cloud of his breath accompanied him like a chummy ghost. The Angelus rang, its bronze voice pouring through the sheepfold and over the orchard walls in slow, rich waves. It was a call to prayer. If he didn't go in, he would be missed, and if he was missed, he would be whipped. He didn't go in. Laszlo was always finding ways to slip off on his own, and his legs were always striped from the hazel switch that hung from a hook with his name on it. It was worth it, to get away from the monks and the rules and the chores and the life that pinched like tight shoes. To play. "Turn back now if you know what's good for you," he warned imaginary enemies. He held a sword in each hand, black apple branches with the stout ends bound in twine to make hilts. He was a small, underfed waif, with cuts on his head where the monks nicked it, shaving it against lice. But he held himself with exquisite dignity, and there could be no doubt that in his own mind, in that moment, he was a warrior. And not just any warrior, but a Tizer Cane, fiercest that ever was. "No outsider," he told his foes, "has ever set eyes on the Forbidden City, and as long as I draw breath, none ever will." "We're in luck, then," the foes replied, and they were more real to him in the twilight than the monks whose chanting drifted downhill from the abbey. "Because you won't be drawing breath for much longer." Laszlo's gray eyes narrowed to slits. "You think you can defeat me?" The black trees danced. His breath ghost scudded away on a gust, only to be replaced by another. His shadow splayed out huge before him, and his mind gleamed with ancient wars and winged beings, a mountain of melted demon bones, and the city on the far side of it, a city that had vanished in the mist of time. This was the old mystery. It had come to him from a senile monk, Brother Cyrus. He was an invalid, and it fell to the charity boys to bring him his meals. He wasn't kind. No grandfather figure, no mentor. He had a terrible grip and was known to hold the boys by the wrist for hours, forcing them to repeat nonsense catechism and confess to all manner of wickedness that they could scarce understand, let alone have committed. They all had a terror of him and his gnarled raptor hands, and the bigger boys, sooner than protect the smaller, sent them to his lair in their stead. Laszlo was as scared as the rest, yet he volunteered to bring all the meals. Why? Because Brother Cyrus told stories. Stories were not such smiled upon at the abbey. At best, they distracted from spiritual contemplation. At worst, they honored false gods and festered into sin. But Brother Cyrus had gone beyond such strictures. His mind had slipped its moorings. He never seemed to understand where he was, and his confusion infuriated him. His face grew clenched and red. Spittle flew when he ranted. But he had his moments of calm, when he slipped through some cellar door in his memory, back to his boyhood, and the stories his grandmother used to tell him. He couldn't remember the other monks' names, or even the prayers that had been his vocation for decades, but the stories poured from him, and Laszlo listened. He listened the way a cactus drinks rain. In the south and east of the continent of Nama, far, far from northerly Zazma, there was a vast desert called the El-Muthathleth, the crossing of which was an art perfected by few and fiercely guarded against all others. Somewhere across its emptiness lay a city that had never been seen. It was a rumor, a fable, but it was a rumor and fable from which marvels emerged, carried by camels across the desert to fire the imaginations of folk the world over. The city had a name. The men who drove the camels, who brought the marvels, they told the name and they told stories, and the name and the stories made their way with the marvels to distant lands where they conjured visions of glittering domes and tame white stags, women so beautiful they melted the mind, and men whose scimitars blinded with their shine. For centuries this was so. Wings of palaces were devoted to the marvels, and shelves of libraries to the stories. Traders grew rich, adventurers grew bold, and went to find the city for themselves. None returned. It was forbidden to Farangi, outsiders, who, if they survived the El Muthalef crossing, were executed as spies. Not that that stopped them from trying. Forbid a man something, and he craves it like his soul's salvation, all the more so when that something is the source of incomparable riches. Many tried, none ever returned. The desert horizon birthed sun after sun, and it seemed as if nothing would ever change. But then, 200 years ago, the caravans stopped coming. In the western outposts of the El Muthalef, Alkanost, and others, they watched for the heat-distorted silhouettes of camel trains to emerge from the emptiness as they always had. But they did not, and they did not, and they did not. There were no more camels, no more men, no more marvels, and no more stories, ever. That was the last that was ever heard from the Forbidden City, the unseen city, the lost city, and this was the mystery that had opened Laszlo's mind like a door. What had happened? Did the city still exist? He wanted to know everything. He learned to coax Brother Cyrus into that place of reverie, and he collected the stories like treasure. Laszlo owned nothing, not one single thing, but from the first the stories felt like his own hoard of gold. The domes of the city, Brother Cyrus, were all connected by silk ribbons, and children balanced upon them like tightrope walkers, dashing from palace to palace in capes of colored feathers. No doors were ever closed to them, and even the bird cages were open for the birds to come and go as they pleased. And wondrous fruits grew everywhere, ripe for the plucking, and cakes were left out on window ledges, free for the taking. Laszlo had never even seen a cake, let alone tasted it, and he'd been whipped for eating windfall apples that were more worm than fruit. These visions of freedom and plenty bewitched him. Certainly they distracted from spiritual contemplation, but in the same way that the sight of a shooting star distracts from the ache of an empty belly. They marked his first consideration that there might be other ways of living than the one he knew, better, sweeter ways. The streets of the city, Brother Cyrus said, were tiled with lapis lazuli and kept scrupulously clean, so as not to soil the long, long hair the ladies wore loose and trailing behind them like bolts of blackest silk. Elegant white stags roamed the streets like citizens, and reptiles big as men drifted in the river. The first were spectrals, and the substance of their antlers, spectralis, or lis, was more precious than gold. The second were sphedaggers, whose pink blood was an elixir of immortality. There were ravids, too, great cats with fangs like scythes, and birds that mimicked human voices, and scorpions whose sting imparted superhuman strength. And there were the Tizerkane warriors. They wielded blades called Hreshtek, sharp enough to slice a man off his shadow, and kept scorpions in brass cages hooked to their belts. Before battle, they would thrust a finger through a small opening to be stung, and under the influence of the venom, they were unstoppable. "You think you can defeat me?" Laszlo defied his orchard foes. "There are 100 of us," they replied, "and only one of you. What do you think?" "I think you should believe every story you've ever heard about the Tizerkane, and turn around and go home." Their laughter sounded like the creaking of branches, and Laszlo had no choice but to fight. He poked his finger into the little lopsided cage of twigs and twine that dangled from his rope belt. There was no scorpion in it, only a beetle stunned by the cold, but he gritted his teeth against an imagined sting and felt venom power bloom in his blood. And then he lifted his blades, arms raised in a V, and roared. He roared the city's name, like thunder, like an avalanche, like the war cry of the seraphim who had come on wings of fire and cleansed the world of demons. His foes stumbled, they gaped. The venom sang in him, and he was something more than human. He was a whirlwind. He was a god. They tried to fight, but they were no match for him. His swords flashed lightning as 2 by 2 he disarmed them all. In the thick of play, his daydreams were so vivid that a glimpse of reality would have shocked him. If he could have stood apart and seen the little boy crashing through the frost-stiff bracken, waving branches around, he would have scarcely recognized himself, so deeply did he inhabit the warrior in his mind's eye, who had just disarmed 100 enemies and sent them staggering home. In triumph, he tipped back his head and let out a cry of, "Weep!" He froze, confused. The word had broken from his mouth like a curse, leaving an aftertaste of tears. He had reached for the city's name, as he had just a moment ago, but it was gone. He tried again, and again found weep instead. It was like putting out his hand for a flower and coming back with a slug or sodden handkerchief. His mind recoiled from it. He couldn't stop trying, though, and each time was worse than the one before. He groped for what he knew had been there, and all he fished up was the awful word, weep, slick with wrongness, damp as bad dreams, and tinged with its residue of salt. His mouth curled with its bitterness. A feeling of vertigo swept over him, and the mad certainty that it had been taken. It had been taken from his mind. He felt sick, robbed, diminished. He raced back up the slope, scrabbling over low stone walls, and pelted through the sheepfold, past the garden, and through the cloister, still gripping his apple-branch swords. He saw no one but was seen. There was a rule against running, and anyway he ought to have been at vespers. He ran straight to Brother Cyrus's cell and shook him awake. "The name," he said, gasping for breath. "The name is missing. The city from the story. Tell me its name." He knew deep down that he hadn't forgotten it, that this was something else, something dark and strange, but there was still the chance that maybe Brother Cyrus would remember, and all would be well. But Brother Cyrus said, "What do you mean, you fool boy? It's weep!" And Laszlo had just time to see the old man's face buckle with confusion before a hand closed on his collar and yanked him out the door. "Wait," he implored, "please!" To no avail. He was dragged all the way to the abbot's office, and when they whipped him this time, it wasn't with his hazel switch, which now hung in a row with all the other boys' switches, but with one of his apple boughs. He was no Tiserkane now. Never mind 100 enemies. He was disarmed by a single monk and beaten with his own sword. Some hero. He limped for weeks and was forbidden from seeing Brother Cyrus, who'd grown so agitated by his visit that he'd had to be sedated. There were no more stories after that, and no more escapes, at least not into the orchard, or anywhere outside his own mind. The monks kept a sharp eye on him, determined to keep him free of sin, and of joy, which, if not explicitly a sin, at least clears a path to it. He was kept busy. If he wasn't working, he was praying. If he wasn't praying, he was working, always under adequate supervision to prevent his vanishing like a wild creature into the trees. At night he slept, exhausted as a grave digger, too tired even to dream. It did seem as though the fire in him was smothered, and the thunder and the avalanche, the war cry and the whirlwind, all stamped out. As for the name of the vanished city, it had vanished too. Laszlo would always remember the feel of it in his mind, though. It had felt like calligraphy, if calligraphy were written in honey, and that was as close to it as he or anyone could come. It wasn't just him and Brother Cyrus. Wherever the name had been found, printed on the spines of books that held its stories, in the old yellowed ledgers of merchants who bought its goods, and woven into the memories of anyone who'd ever heard it, it was simply erased, and weep was left in its place. This was the new mystery. This, he never doubted, was magic. That was the prologue and the first chapter of Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. If you're interested in finding out what happens next, and I encourage you because this is one of my favorite books ever, you can find this book here at the Cazenovia Library. And of course, you can go online to the Mid-York system to order one from a library closer to you. If you're not anywhere near the Mid-York system, you can log into your own local library system and see if they have a copy. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next week.